Welcome to the Sacred Journey podcast. I'm Elizabeth Marth Tarara, and I'm a certified conscious uncoupling and calling in the one coach, as well as a certified spiritual and emotional growth coach. And my purpose in this podcast is to shift the perspective on midlife changes being something of a crisis to the truth that they are a beautiful opportunity to awaken and a necessary part of our life's journey. I specialize in walking with women who are experiencing disconnect from themselves and who are facing life-changing experiences. And as hard as these situations can be, there is still the truth that these painful times can be the catalyst that can change our lives for the better. Change is what ignites the desire deep within us to reconnect to our true selves and our true divine purpose. It moves us to step up and live the lives we are being called to live, reclaiming yourself and reclaiming your life. So if you are hearing the call to walk this journey, keep listening, because I promise this is going to be good. And remember, life is all about the journey, not the destination. Hello, and welcome to the Sacred Journey podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Marth Tarara, and I am excited to bring you today's subject. It's interesting. I sat down yesterday to write my blog, which I generally do before my podcast, and I was going to do it on support this week and how women self-abandon with support, not asking for support, even though we can complain all the time how much help we don't have. We don't always allow in the help that wants to come. But that's going to have to wait for another day, because right before I sat down to write, I was sent an amazingly beautiful article by Cheryl Strayed that was in The Sun. It's so important. I'm going to have a link to it in the show notes. Her story was the love of my life. And it is a story about her mom, and it is a story about grief. And as I was reading this, I knew that the subject for today needed to change. I've been doing the self-abandonment series, and everything that I share with you is a personal experience on my journey. Perhaps not exactly in all the areas that we cover, but in some way it is a personal experience in my journey. And reading this article that Cheryl Strayed wrote, she had such this deep connection with her mother. And when her mother passed, it changed everything for her. It changed her marriage. It changed her sense of self. This is my interpretation. And she writes of it so authentically and so raw and so beautifully. And it very much got me thinking about my own experience of grief. And I go into deeper detail in my blog about my own personal journey, and I'll touch on it a little bit here. But my intention for this podcast is really to address how grief touches us all. And in the article, it was about death and the grief we suffer when someone we love dies, regardless of the relationship that we had with them, right? I think that was more my story, while Cheryl portrays this incredible bond that her and her mother had, that in my judgment seems like a positive light. When my mother passed, there were so many emotions and varying degrees of sadness, of relief, of anger, of disappointment, of shame that went along with it, which is what makes up grief, right? Grief is made up of so many emotions that it was quite like counter my feelings. And yet it struck me that grief isn't just about death. Grief doesn't just come in death, because then when I went to write my blog, I went back to my childhood and how grief, the feeling of grief, the overwhelming feeling of all of those emotions, sadness, loss, abandonment, fear, anger, confusion, shame, that I believe are just some of the emotions that make up grief had been with me for so much of my life. It seemed that there was grief throughout my childhood, my adolescence, from leaving people that I really, really loved as a young one and coming, moving halfway across the country and coming into a situation that was completely dysfunctional and essentially a lie. Um, and then needing to understand as a 5-year-old that um, I felt, and perspectives were that, I was the cause of a lot of this. For those of you, many of you who don't know my story, I was the product of an affair, and my dad was married with 4 other children, and a wife. So he had a family while his children were grown, the youngest one being around 17 when I was brought to the Midwest from California. I left my grandmother and my grandfather and my aunt and my uncle, who were the stable ones in my family, as well as a man who I have come to call my stepfather, who claimed me as his own, and moved to the Midwest, Northern Illinois, to a completely chaotic situation where my mother and I were understandably in ways like regarded as, like big A's on both of our foreheads, chests, however you want to say it. All of that to say, the grief that was around there and that surrounded so much of my childhood and adolescence was so overwhelming that what needed to happen in order for me to continue to survive, to go on, was to go into my own world, to fantasize that things were different, to lie essentially where I went, because I, in certain circles, I was the child that, ripped up a marriage and was the product of this horrid, love affair. And I don't sugarcoat it because it wasn't pretty. And I don't anymore. I've done so much work around this and I've come to understand, to the best of my ability, all sides of the situation, and have love and compassion for everyone involved, that there was grief all around that on so many levels. That feeling was always with me. And coming back around to the self-abandonment place, lying about who I was because I didn't want to be who I was. That didn't feel good to me, even though that wasn't mine. And that continued, the lying, the avoidance, the fantasizing. And whenever grief would come, I would push it away because it was too much. It was too much as a child. And then in other circumstances that, would come up through life is going to have grief, I would do everything I could to avoid that. And now in the work that I do, both in conscious uncoupling and in calling in the one, as well as help women find their sense of self after a huge loss in midlife. That's the focus of my work. And that loss can be a divorce, it can be a death, it can be an illness, it can be the changing of kids leaving and figuring out what's the next step. The grief is real, whether it's death or another circumstance. And the self-abandonment is real also. I see it within women every day, either that I know or that I hear from, not wanting to step into our grief. And I get it. All of this comes because after I read this article, I didn't want to deal with the overwhelming feeling of losing my mom. Her death was not the same as the other deaths that I had recently experienced. Within a 6-year period, we lost my mother-in-law, we lost my dad from dementia, my grandmother, my sister-in-law, and then my mom. My dad, even my mother-in-law's death, is heartbreaking as it was. There was beauty in it, and there was beauty in my grandmother's, and there was beauty in my father's. And then my mother's death was a completely different situation. And while I can see the beauty now, and I could see the beauty in it then, I had a little bit of a different relationship to death. It was still so different and so hard, and I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to feel all of the emotions, right? Because I believe grief isn't just sadness. It is confusion and anger and shame and all of the other things that we've mentioned, and anything on the spectrum that one experiences. And so once again, I did the self-abandoning. There was a period I drank too much wine. It wasn't something that was necessarily a problem, but I didn't feel good, or I exercised too much. Or one of my things is I am going to go into every program that I can do, and I am going to do all the self-improvement work and become, the very, very best version of myself, which is great. And obviously it's made me who I am today. And I encourage other people to do it. And when anything's out of moderation, like we're avoiding something, right? I isolated myself from people, from friends, from groups. I numbed, which is a part, like, right? Numbing is a piece, but it's not sustainable. And other things that women do will deny. We won't be honest about how we're feeling. We'll push down things. We'll repress our feelings until it's showing up in physical ailments in our body, whether it's actual illness or whether it's weight gain, weight loss, loss of sexual desire, loss of social interaction, lose ourselves in our work, lose ourselves in something other than being in our feelings. And I guess today isn't as much as how to do it different, as much as it is the realization that grief is real and it takes time and it gets to be felt, as uncomfortable as it is. One of the other things, this is one of the main things that happened for me, because I was on a spiritual journey. I think we're always on spiritual journeys, but this was like the deeper spiritual journey I had embarked on. And because I do tend to have a different view of death, of it being like a passing and a transition to another place that's beautiful and amazing, I wasn't supposed to feel grief, right? A lot of times there are religious people who will be like, well, if you really believed in God, like, you wouldn't be sad because they're going to a better place and they're at peace and everything is fine. And like, you don't have the right to grieve. And while that isn't said, it is absolutely intended. Maybe that's me who's only had that experience. I'm guessing not. And then also I would be less of a spiritual person or less on my path if I was in my sadness and in my feelings, because they weren't cleared and they weren't healed and they weren't happy and they weren't good. And even along my path with different mentors and coaches and therapists, there had been also that idea that you need to get over your anger. I had a lot of anger. So while there was sadness, there was a lot of anger and a lot of like, I'm never gonna get the chance to be heard, feel seen, all those different things, which is another normal part of grief. And it was as if I had those feelings, there was something wrong with me. And I think that's the other piece I really just want to stress. And that was so beautiful in Cheryl Strayed's essay, is that like, nobody gets to tell you how to do grief. There are so many beautiful books out there, some of which I will also put on the show notes, that are there to walk alongside you with grief. And it can be a very lonely path, especially for those who haven't experienced what you may be going through. And yet there is help. I had an amazing grief counselor who I was not going to go see after my mom died because I didn't think I needed grief counseling. I had other things going on, and she was amazing. Delinda Grindle, she's a grief therapist in my area, and I didn't appreciate the work that I did with her until later, and still now, even 4 years later, look back and I'm like, wow, to have someone walk with you. And so that's why I do highly recommend, like, if you're needing help and needing working with somebody who is specifying in grief, because it, in my opinion, is a specialized area, to make sure that you are able to do the feeling, do the allowing, and not get so quick to get out of it. Which is funny coming from me, because like that is something I still deal with, is to, okay, I'm feeling it now, I want to get out of the grief. And it's learning for me, in my experience, to allow it and be in it and see what needs to heal in there, because there's always like the gold of why it's coming up, the realization, the growth, the memory, and maybe just the connection. Self-abandoning, when we can be aware, when we are not allowing ourselves to be or feel what it is we're truly feeling and are masking it with something else, it's a form of self-abandonment. And just to create the awareness around it, just to create the awareness that there's a different way to do things, rather than avoid or repress or deny what it is that's going on with us. Yeah, I think that that's it for today. I hope that this touches someone who needed sharing around grief, whatever it is that you may be going through. You are not alone. There are always resources and always avenues for help. And I guess the last thing that I wanted to say, it's not that grief is a place we want to stay. It's not that the healing and the processing is where we want to stay. But in order to not have it creep up in harmful ways within our body and within our emotions, I believe it is a place we need to go to. And as Delinda Grindle shared with me, grief is not linear. It is a spiral. So things most likely will come back up. But the more we deal with them, the less they take us down, the less they have the power to overwhelm us a lot of the time. And if not, that's when we reach out for help. That's when we reach out for therapy, a doctor, a friend, a coach, anything like that. So thinking of you all, I will be back next week. Take care. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this midlife journey together. Join me next week as we continue to seek within ourselves to find what we are really looking for, so we can awaken to all the bountiful possibilities that life provides, and then align with the beautiful energy of love within each of us. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. All of the info is in the show notes. And you can check out my website, sacredfreedom.life, where I have my blog, videos, book reviews, meditations, and more. And if you feel so inclined, you can book a complimentary discovery call with me to learn about how you can work with me on your own journey of awakening. See you next week.